reframing the purpose to being the process, toward the striving can be so beneficial. One, because it combats those things like failure. And two, because you put a lot less pressure on yourself.
This is Running for Real, the podcast for runners who know that for every runner's high, there are just as many lows. All those just missed PRs, easy runs that feel hard, injury blues, and more. Each week, we'll talk to running, health, and wellness experts about their highs, lows, and best advice to build our confidence. Running for Real is about being honest, being brave, and most of all, not feeling alone. And now here's our host, who is terrible at napping, Tina Muir.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to episode 109 of the Running for Real podcast. Thank you so much for joining me here today. Now, last week, my sports psychologist, Evie, answered your questions about mental training and just some of the issues that we deal with within our training and racing. And I hope that episode was helpful. And if your question was answered, I hope you really enjoyed what she had to say. And be sure to go back and listen if you missed it last week. Now, today we have a runner couple who everyone wishes were their friends. Well, I guess saying that, I'm not actually sure if we're friends yet or whether they would class me as their friends. I'd hope so, but who knows? Either way, Megan and David Roche are two wonderful people, and let's just say they would fit in so perfectly within the Running for Real community with the approach that they have to their lives. Now, I wanted to bring them on as you guys are constantly sharing their articles and saying how helpful they are. And I absolutely love their book, The Happy Runner, which is packed with good advice, but written in a different kind of fun way. So I reached out to them to ask them if they were interested, and of course they were. So I'm happy to have them on here. Now, David was the 2014 USATF Trail Runner of the Year at the sub-ultra distance. He's a 2-time national champion and 3-time member of Team USA. And Megan is the 2016 USATF Trail Runner of the Year at the ultra and sub-ultra distance. She's a 5-time national champion, North American mountain running champion, and 6-time member of Team USA. But these two have a lot more to offer than just their running results. And I'm going to let them explain the rest. There's so much to learn. And I just want to take a moment to thank all of you who have left a rating or review on iTunes or your favorite podcast player. Those mean the world to me, and I'm planning on starting to read one out at the start of each episode. So if you haven't already left a review, go do it. You may just get a shout out. And if you have already left a review, I'm pretty sure you can redo your review, leave another one, and it will push it to the top of the list. So maybe you'll get a shout out too. Let's take a moment to thank our sponsors, and we'll go right to meet Megan and David. This episode is sponsored by Aftershokz, the award-winning headphone brand, best known for its open-ear listening experience, powered by patented best-in-class bone conduction technology. Aftershokz headphones sit outside your ear so you can hear your music and your surroundings. I know. Aftershokz is a must-have for runners, providing the ultimate level of safety and comfort without compromising sound quality. To learn more and save $50 on Aftershokz endurance bundles, visit tina.aftershokz.com. That's tina.aftershokz.com. Thank you so much to our loyal friends at Body Health for sponsoring this episode of the Running for Real podcast. We all know by now that we need protein, but what many don't know is that even though we do get amino acids that help with repair from our food, the essential amino acids and perfect amino are the exact proportion needed for maximum utilization by the body, meaning our bodies have to work less hard because, come on, it's already being pushed hard enough by our training. So do your body a favor, get yourself some Body Health Perfect Aminos by visiting tinamuir.com/aminos. Megan, David, thank you so much for joining me today on the Running for Real podcast. As I just mentioned to you, this has been a long time coming. I should have had you on years ago now, but I'm excited that we're finally making this happen.
Thank you so much for having us. We're just so excited. I mean, the number of times we have read your writing and shared it with like every athlete we coach is pretty remarkable. So yeah, it feels like we've already had a lot of conversations with you, just one-sided.
Well, I feel the same way.
And your journey too has been such an inspiration to so many of the female athletes that we coach. And so to be able to have this conversation, I know will be meaningful to some of those athletes.
Oh, thank you. Well, hello to anyone who is one of those people. So I appreciate that. And, you starting off with this, I'm not sure how many people would have heard of you both or heard of your journey. I don't have too many people who are, that involved in the ultra running world, although they do know, or the mountain or trail running world for that matter, but they do know of your writing and I know of your book and things, but I'm not sure people quite realize the kind of impressive group of athletes that you do actually coach on your swap team, which we'll talk about that in a minute. But just to mention some names for people listening, Kat Bradley, Amelia Boone, Ethan Newbury, who I was not expecting to see on your list, who is Ginger Runner, for those who recognize the name, Elizabeth Carey, who is a friend of mine, love her to death, and Jason Schlab. So, some impressive names there and many names. Your list of athletes was huge, very impressive in itself. And I mentioned SWAP, so that stands for Some Work, All Play. Tell the listeners about why you came up with the name for that, because it's a bit different to the usual like results fast or something like that people usually come up with. So why that name?
Yeah, I feel like I wish there was a more romantic story about the name itself, but like the actual origin story was 2013. And Megan was in medical school working so hard, and we had always wanted to coach. We'd always coached a little bit on the side, and it's just late at night one night, like late at night for us is probably like 7:30 p.m.
Yeah, me too.
usually around our bedtime. But we're sitting there and like, okay, let's do this. And so the first question was, well, what is the name? And we're like, well, we don't know much, and even back then we understood the extent of our own ignorance. And so like, well, play is like the most important thing, and work, not so much. And so it just became that little turn of phrase. And then really interestingly, that kind of formed a thesis statement for how we coached later. Mm-hmm. So it was really efficient in that way, that from this little bumbling, not really knowing what it was doing website that, kind of grew over time, it evolved into what it became, which is, even though there's a lot of pros on the team, like we try to be extra clear that we don't care about race results. Like we've seen from ourselves and from athletes we coach, and just, understanding it logically that doesn't necessarily change anything in the long run for these people. What we care about is the fulfilling process. So results can be a part of that, but you can't be chasing it for their own sake.
And getting back to that origin story too, SWAP for us was a hobby when we started it. And we did it just because we simply loved coaching. We loved working with athletes. And we both found that we learned a lot from athletes. So because it was a hobby, we really knew nothing when we started coaching. So we had a .blogspot website for about 4 years, which is really embarrassing. We actually just took it down off the web a few weeks ago. So we've definitely learned a lot too about kind of like building up a coaching business and how that works through this process.
Not just web design.
Yeah.
Other things other than that too.
And for those listening who hear those high-end names and they think, how the heck did you, go from not feeling like you didn't know what you were talking about? Although I'm sure many people listening would argue that even at that point you knew quite a lot. But how did you go from that to getting these big names? Was it kind of you being like, hey, can you do me a favor and let me train you for a while? Or was it kind of just people started getting results and then it kind of, spread from there?
Yeah. So I think it was just kind of a natural growth. So starting with the first few people that joined, were just people that wanted to run their first 5K or maybe drop a few minutes in the marathon. So they had good experiences and they told people, and those people told people. And eventually that led, that circle started bringing in some of the, maybe the big professional runner names. But I think at the end of the day, it all comes back to relationships, because professional runners or people that might not be finishing as far up, like they're all giving it their all, right? Like we're all experiencing the same things in this process. And so, when an athlete like understands that you value the relationship and sees that investment, like then, I think the pro, like not so pro distinction is mainly just important, like insofar as like they know about you rather than, getting like validation or whatever. And so it was crazy. I remember when the first woman athlete that like was like, oh my God, this woman, she was a former biathlete and she was coming to trail running. And when she emailed, I was so excited. I was like giddy. And it's like a little bit through the looking glass to see where it's at now.
Yeah.
I think an interesting thing too with the professional runners is that we take kind of an evidence-based approach to it, along with a lot of science. And then at the same time, also really focus on the process over results. And that's a very unique style of coaching to have both. And I think a lot of the professional athletes appreciate that. And that's something that we've seen over time.
Mm-hmm. Especially as we're going to talk about later, it's so easy when for a professional athlete in particular, but any athlete, any runner really, to get the balance out of line, to get kind of obsessed with it. Amelia being a good example of talking about that comeback that she originally said, you know, she wanted to come back and all that pressure she put on herself, but realizing that meant she was out of balance. So we'll talk about that a bit more. But before we I just want to drill this point home one more time, being you coach one another. Now, I love that because like, you know, my husband coaches me, but there is no way I could ever coach him because I just wouldn't have a clue where to start. And you know, it just would never really come up. But I love the fact that you two both obviously are good at coaching athletes as you've got where you have. But why is it important for you to coach one another rather than saying, well, I'm a good coach, so I can just coach myself?
I think I actually learn the most through coaching David because I get to see everything that he goes through during the day. I get to see his entire response to different training cycles that I throw at him. And so to be able to see an athlete like that in a controlled setting, it's helpful for me. And it's also just really fun. We have training logs that we use to communicate training with each other. So we treat each other like any normal athlete that we would coach. But David's training log is filled with a lot of interesting jokes and small talk and humor through the time. So it's kind of like a fun journal between us, those coaching logs.
It's definitely an R-rated journal. No, yeah, I think for me, like she's way smarter than I am, so that's always beneficial when you get to go up in quality. But more than that, like, you know, just I fully trust her in a way that my own individual judgment, like our judgment of ourselves in anything in life, not just running, is always skewed. Mm-hmm. Like the people that look in the mirror and, you know, see something different than maybe the world sees, whether that's full body dysmorphia or just seeing something that might not like be what they expect or want. But the same thing goes for how you think about your training and all these things. So yeah, I mean, for me, having that external person that's there with support, you know, she's not necessarily my wife when she's coaching me. She's like my coach and my friend. But, you know, it's just so valuable to give me perspective that I don't have.
Is there any, I just feel like if that was it would be so easy to be like, well, don't you think it would be better for me to do that? Like, do you kind of have a rule where you're not allowed to like challenge each other or kind of suggest other things? Like, I feel like if I do it to Steve all the time, that's probably why I'm like, why am I doing this instead of this? Maybe that's just me being like too controlling. But like, do you have some kind of rule where you can't really like ask each other to change things, or do you not need anything like that?
We challenge each other quite a bit. I would say that I'm actually David's hardest athlete to coach, probably by a good bit. So sometimes, you know, we wake up in the morning and I'm feeling great. And usually it's always in this direction. It's like, hey, I want to do a workout today. Like today feels like a good workout day. And so we do kind of go back and forth, but it feels healthy.
Yeah. And I think the way we try to coach generally is to make it a conversation as much as possible, not just with each other, but with other athletes too. So you know, like the way we found over time is that we try to check in with every athlete every day. Just because like, you know, life gets in the way, but also that intimacy that can form from, you know, these micro interactions can really mean a lot. So when it comes to these things, like, yeah, you know, the plan says one thing, but like, I don't know. I mean, maybe over the course of coaching all these years, I can think of like 2 athletes that have executed like every day in a long-term plan. One being Kat Bradley when she won Western States, and one, like, you know what I mean? Then, so in other words, yeah, like I wouldn't say it's challenging. I would say it's just like starting that conversation and trying to coach without ego. I think that's one thing that both of us really try to do. You know, we don't always live up to that standard, but we try to do everything without ego if we can.
Well, from what we see the rest of the world, I would say you two definitely. That's one thing that you can say you can check off. Now, I mentioned earlier about pressure, and I'd love to kind of talk about Ashley. Is it Bransevin? Is that how you say her name?
Yeah,
okay.
Ashley Bransevin.
Bransevin. Okay, and Claire Gallagher, who I thought were 2 good examples within your kind of athletes that showed how pressure and expectation can get to you and really make you struggle within the sport. But bringing it back to like your joy or something that is your why can make all the difference. So maybe you could just, one of you each could explain about kind of what happened with both of them. And then we can talk about, what it was that was special with what they were able to find to kind of bring it back to joy.
So I'll start with Claire, and then Megan will just mention Ashley real quick. So I'll compress the story as much as I can. But Claire basically burst onto the scene from nowhere when she won the Leadville 100 in 2016. So she had been a really good runner at Princeton. I trained her butt off. It didn't come from nowhere for her, but according to the outside world, it might have. We had met her just before that, and started talking a lot about these issues. And Claire was probably 23 or 24. Has this huge result that basically puts her, as one of the best athletes in the world at these types of events. And, that's a lot to put on anyone, especially when it happens pretty suddenly. And so she trained real hard. She got a golden ticket to Western States after, so we're coaching her and she's getting towards Western States, and she was so fit and ready for that race. And she gets to mile 90. She was in third place, moving up exactly where you want to be. And all of a sudden, she essentially lost the ability to even walk when a Baker cyst behind her knee acted up and became a major issue. And so, that's the big question. What happens at that moment? What happens at the moment when, you have these expectations and you don't reach them? And Claire, she really took a step back and found out who she was. It wasn't overnight, but, after a few weeks, we talked on the phone and she was like, okay, I want to advocate for the environment. I want to, try to be there for the community. I want to try to find my potential, but only within the context of this life that's meaningful to me. And what was so cool about that story is not even the race results, because, since then she's dominated and done amazing things. But what's coolest about that to me is that she started really doubling down on this environmental advocacy piece. And she was just doing this on her own spare time, doing all this crazy work. And my background was in environmental issues. So, I was admiring it so much, but part of me was also it's a lot that you're doing there without much payoff. But the coolest moment was Patagonia reached out to her, not as an athlete, not as a pro athlete for them, but as an environmental advocate for them. After so she put in all this work, got it back. And now she does that. She travels the country doing that work. And to me, it's just she found this grounding in what was meaningful to her. And, she was fortunate to learn at a young age that she was never going to find those answers at a finish line.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
Ashley has actually a pretty similar story. So Ashley Brassovin, for people who don't know, was a Foot Locker national champion in high school. She was a total phenom. I didn't even run track in high school. And I remember knowing about her and watching the sensational finish over Jordan Hissey. And then she went on to run at Duke and unfortunately struggled with stress fractures. And she's very open about kind of the history that she's had at Duke and her collegiate history. And she went from being this phenom with so many people watching her to being unable to really compete at that same level at Duke. And it was extremely challenging on her. Both the internal pressure and the external pressure kind of combined just to make this really gnarly force that she had to counter with. And what she did with that was amazing. So she became an environmental consultant. She works now in Colorado. She found a love of trail running. She's like a social butterfly here. I'm continuously impressed by all that she does here in Colorado.
She's the most invested friend you could ever have. So we were her friend before we were her coaches. And she gives as much of that, of herself to that as she gives to anything else. And it's the coolest thing.
She's an amazing, spunky human. And I actually didn't know her before she was going through all of this. But I think from what I understand, she just became the person that she became because of what she went through. And for me, it was so inspiring to see.
And so, and since she's won a couple national championships and she's had a lot of really cool moments since, but it hasn't been a straight line, these narratives sound neat, but for both Claire and Ashley, there have been major setbacks, some of which people know publicly, some of which, we all have our stuff that we maybe don't put out there as openly. And, the cool thing is I think both of them have accepted that those setbacks are coming and that is part of the joy of it too. Yeah. It's not just the good moments, it's the bad moments that give it meaning.
Yes, I love that. And that is one of the many reasons I wanted you to talk about those two in particular, when it came to the pressure. And also for people listening who are in a downswing, or even a point where you don't know if you're ever going to run again, or you don't know if you ever get over this injury, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the end of it.
Yeah. So running is maybe not the best sport if you're not fully accepting of like kind of the Zen philosophy of the ups and downs of life and existence and all these things. So what we really try to do for athletes is zoom out and like accept that existence itself is fickle and uncertain. Like that sounds like the type of thing that maybe shouldn't be talked about when you're talking about running. Like, how is that relevant? But it's so relevant because running is just a microcosm of what we're experiencing in life with all these different things. And so, yeah, I mean, podcasting or whatever being a great example. Like some days you'll have an amazing podcast and it'll just be this like incredible thing and you get great feedback. Some days, it's not going to be great. You'll write a crappy article. You'll, do all these things that maybe don't meet your standards. But the key is to keep going. If you're moving forward, that is all that matters, whether it's running or personal life or all these different things, just moving. And so, yeah, what we try to encourage people to do is like, accept that the down times are coming and try to laugh and give yourself as much slack in that process, because, without those, like we wouldn't even probably be doing this in the first place.
And we're going to get on to Addie in just a second, because I think she's the most logical next step. But before we get on to that, I just want to mention you, related to this, you talked about in your book, The Happy Runner, which I will mention now for anyone listening. Megan and David wrote a wonderful book called The Happy Runner. I think many of you will really enjoy it. It's written in a very similar way to the way that I write articles, kind of very much just speaking to you as a friend. And we'll talk more about it as the interview goes on. But one of the things you talked about was burnout, and kind of when the finish line becomes your why, which you mentioned a minute ago. That is when burnout is really likely, and, running just, you can't sustain it. And myself being a prime example of that, that's where I ended up. And look at what I did. I stepped away, thought I could be done with it. And so why is someone listening who is kind of getting to the point maybe where they can see that it is really about the finish line, and when they think about their why, it's about crossing the finish line. Why is that dangerous? And like, what can we do about it?
Well, so the big thing is no matter what your finish line is, you reach it and you realize nothing changes. Like, and I'm not just talking about running here. Like, we've seen it constantly, and this is demonstrated by a lot of psychological studies. Like, you get a promotion, a lot of people then have happiness decreases. Marriage ceremonies can be the same way. Like, the things you see behind the scenes when you're a coach are pretty mind blowing in some ways. So, the psychological principle is called the arrival fallacy, where, you reach the goals that you've been setting this whole time, only to realize that like it was about the striving all along. So, yeah, reframing the purpose to being the process, toward the striving can be so beneficial. One, because it combats those things like failure. And two, because you just you put a lot less pressure on yourself. Most people running are pretty darn motivated. Otherwise, we'd be sitting on the couch and eating Cheetos. And like, for motivated people, like, not reaching goals can be the ultimate, just like absolutely deflate you, not just as a runner, but as a human being. And so, our goal is to like reframe what the whole goal is, because if we do that, then maybe we can like put a little wind in people's sails. Like, I always say that one of our goals as coaches is not necessarily to lead someone anywhere or to tell them where they're going, even just to try to give them a little tailwind, through enthusiasm and support and like reframing these things. So, yeah, we can all give ourselves a little tailwind if we reframe these questions.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think too, also making sure that goals are internally focused is something that's really important. And we sit down with athletes and do some goal setting sessions where we have goals that are process based, and then big scary goals that are long-term based. And I think that sometimes burnout comes when you're training so hard and you're so focused on that one like finish line goal, and kind of having that reinforcement of the internal goals, the things that get you out of bed, the things that bring you joy.
What would be some examples of those?
I think for me personally, it's the joy of being out in nature while running. And so I've actually struggled with burnout as a runner. I had overtraining syndrome in college, which was quite a struggle actually, and really made me question my existence as a runner. But for me, I love nature so much. And I find that like, I am my best person when I'm out in nature, exploring and using that as a way to grow. And so for me, when I feel bad on a run, it's like, okay, just go easy, go out and run in nature, enjoy yourself. And I find that's really helpful.
Yeah. And for me, like I was a little kid that spent a lot of time in my own head and, still tend towards that, I would say. And what running does for me is it just makes things so much more real and less ephemeral. Like everything, and that's not just, these good days, because the reality that Instagram posts might not show you is that like a lot of running is just not like that. It's a grind. It doesn't necessarily feel good. You're bored, like all these different things. But the cool thing about running to me are those feelings, are that like, I was out today in a big rainstorm. I was freezing cold. It wasn't like one of those Instagram stories where your arms are out and you're just like, I don't know, like in a romantic comedy where they're like in the rain, like professing their love. It wasn't like that at all. It's more of like a horror. But I mean, to me, that was so cool because like, it took me out of my own head and made me, I don't know. It's a very spiritual practice in that way for me. But those aren't the only, I mean, there's like a million different answers, and they can also be not this like, lofty in the clouds type things. It can be like really mechanical things. Like I really like the way running structures my day or being an athlete structures my day, or the way it makes me think about myself or whatever. But yeah, I mean, essentially like if anyone else is judging your success or failure, including the clock, then, you're going to fail eventually. You're going to like fail yourself. And by failure, I don't mean like this good failure. I mean this bad failure, like existential crisis. Mm-hmm. And that's something that coaching showed us. That was only something we could see through other athletes, because like we just had our own stories, and then seeing that, oh wait, everyone has these stories if they try hard enough in anything in life.
And I just want to kind of counter your answers, which I love, by the way, but I know my listeners, and some of them will say, okay, but, I just want to get my BQ, or I just want to break 4 hours, or once I get there, then I can focus on the process. What would be your response there?
So I guess my point to that is that it never stops.
Yes.
It's so once you get to the BQ, it's like, okay, so I want to get to Boston and I want to have the race of my life. And then once you get to Boston and have the race of your life, it's like, how am I going to qualify for next year? And it never stops. And so I think thinking about it that way is really helpful to structure kind of your decision process and how you view running. And for me as a coach, it's been helpful to frame my own running as an athlete, because I see the athletes go through these large training cycles, and it takes so much time. And you realize like how much time you have as a runner to appreciate the process and not to get so hung up on that result.
Yeah. I mean, the results monster, maybe the ego monster, it has an insatiable hunger. It just keeps consuming. And for the athlete that is trying to break 4 hours or get the BQ or run under 2:30 or whatever the goal is, I mean, we've been fortunate enough to coach some people that have won lots of national championships, world championships, things like that. And like they reach those finish lines and often fall into pits of despair too, if they don't think about these things. Like there is no endpoint that will be satisfying, and I think that a lot of life can be structured like that, not just running. Like, you can apply this to your work. I mean, we see this, probably the place we see it most often is work. Like people destroy themselves, give so much of themselves to their jobs that they lose some of what they love about themselves, thinking that there will be some endpoint where this will stop and I'll hop off this. Maybe they'll call it the golden handcuffs in law or whatever. But what ends up happening is that those people, like that point almost never comes. And so, yeah, trying to reframe the way you think about yourself away from like any metric, any outcome, any of these things. Those outcomes do matter. I'm not saying don't care about them. Train for that sub 4, train for that BQ, train for that national championship. Just know in your heart that it's all about the journey to there. And, a good example is like a ton of athletes are going, let's say I'm not sure, I forget what the day of the Olympic trials is, but let's say CIM, December 3rd next year. Like probably tons of your listeners are going to run really fast there. It's like, I care about December 3rd as a coach, but what I really care about is December 4th. And, to structure the way you think about yourself, not with that race in mind, but with like the future in mind, because that future is where your unlimited potential actually is.
Oh, I love that.
And to really embrace that.
Mm-hmm. And one more thing related to that, you mentioned in your book about post-race blues and how that can kind of be a warning sign that maybe you're a bit too invested in this. So if one of you wants to kind of explain that, just because that is something that a lot of runners do definitely deal with. But I think they kind of see it as, I just need to sign up for another race and then I'll be fine.
I think there's two different elements of post-race blues. So one is like the actual hormonal physical response that you get from racing. And if you're doing long races, that could be a road marathon. For some of our athletes, that could be a 100-mile race. You're producing a lot of cortisol after races, and it throws your body kind of into a funk. And that can vary. That can be a few hours. It can be a couple of days. It can be a month. And it kind of varies on the athlete in the race. So I think there's definitely that one like actual physical component of it. And then the other component of it is it gets back to what David was saying about the arrival fallacy, where, when you reach your goal, what happens at that point? And actually, we like to have, for athletes who are racing, we like to have these questions kind of answered up front. Is like, what is your training cycle going to look like after your race? Or how are your goals going to evolve after your race? And I think having had that up front, it makes it easier to manage, especially when your body is kind of in this physical funk that can happen from cortisol or other hormones that are produced from racing.
Is that even if you don't reach your goal?
Even if you don't reach your goal. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think it gets back to conception of self, which is like, man, I'm the BS artist on this podcast right now. I'm sorry. But, so as coaches, like we greatly admire and look up to, Steve Magnus, Tom Schwartz, Canova, like all these other coaches that we think the world of. But I would say our true coaching idol is Mr. Rogers. It's crazy that if you guys have seen the documentary on him, it gives a little bit of perspective into it. But it's, trying to make athletes comfortable looking in the mirror and telling themselves that they are freaking awesome, because they are, and they are enough no matter what. And that's independent of anything around. So that's like the key component of training and all these other things. And if we can do that, the day before the race, the day of the race, the day after the race, then there's going to be some ups and downs emotionally. You'll get a little let down after the races. That's normal. But you just need to be able to hold on to that understanding that you are enough unconditionally throughout this entire process. Mm-hmm. And the cool thing is that if you're able to do that, not only will you like be better with yourself, because it's way better to go through life like thinking you're awesome than the alternative, you're going to find out what your true athletic potential is. And I think that was the thing with coaching that we didn't necessarily fully understand or articulate at first, that has been the most eye-opening, is that if you're able to reach this place of like fully investing in yourself as, as like this awesome person, no matter what, then you're able to make that leap toward courageous self-belief. And once you have courageous self-belief, there is nothing you can't accomplish. That's how you'll actually find your potential. And the alternative is like a lot of athletes that do this self-judgment framework from race to race, they think they've reached their potential, but they're nowhere close to it.
Mm-hmm. And if someone listening thinks, but once I get to that big goal, then I'll have that confidence. What would be your response there?
Yeah, I mean, I wish you the best. I think it gets back a little bit to the human condition that all of us are insecure. Mm-hmm. Almost all of us. I'm sure there's some exceptions out there. But, even your worst enemy is coming at these big questions of life and not necessarily coming out with the answers that they want all the time. And, in the face of that deeply held insecurity, it's okay. Like, you are being awesome includes that insecurity. Mm-hmm. And so this insecurity in this instance is talking about race results. Like, you're not going to, like, you might get that and feel a little better about yourself temporarily, but you're still going to be like, where do I go when I die? Like, am I a good mom? Am I a good runner? Whatever. And so, the race to race stuff is just drops in a big pond. And so we care way more about the pond than the drops.
Yeah. Okay. And one way of kind of explaining this, and you did this in your book, The Happy Runner, is talking about Addie, your dog. So I would love for you to explain how Addie comes into this. She's clearly an important part of your team, and we have many dog lovers in this group. So what makes dogs in general, or just Addie, so special to kind of realizing a lot of the things we've already been talking about today?
So I think to explain Addie, we can tell her origin story. So David and I actually we were never really dog people, which sounds like blasphemy to us at this point in time, but we just never grew up around dogs. And we were driving to go for a hike one day in North Carolina, and we stumbled upon a pickup truck with a sign that said free pups. And I, of course, had to pee, which is like my classic catchphrase of all time when we're driving. So we pull over and I go to the bathroom and we come back and Addie is sitting in this pickup truck and she is just aggressively wagging her tail, smiling. She actually has like a physical smile that she does.
She bares her teeth. It kind of looks scary until you get to know her. Until
she realizes that it's a smile, but she just was the most enthusiastic creature we had ever seen. And it was the most amazing baseline setting. And so without any like prior understanding of dogs, without any like logistics, like I didn't even know if my apartment complex would allow dogs. We wound up bringing Addie home. And it honestly, I would say it changed our life forever just because we got to see like the power that this relentlessly enthusiastic creature could have on people and had on us. And her voice, that enthusiastic voice is actually in the book as all caps.
Yeah. And I think it gets back to it's appropriate that she started the origin story because that origin story coincides with the first origin story of like when SWAP formed. It was not too long after that. Mm-hmm. And so I think it was kind of it was just timing kind of worked out that way too, that we were thinking a lot about these issues, not because like, oh, we think, Addie has some understanding of enlightenment that, we don't, but because we were like, okay, well, we see how big of an impact she's made on us. How can we make an impact on others that is similar? So I would say, well, what are you going to, you have a good joke.
Oh, no. I was just going to say that Addie's worldview is not very complex. I'm pretty sure through her mind, every 5 minutes, she's like, when is it going to be dinner time?
Yeah.
And so it's obviously a lot easier for her to be enthusiastic and loving than it is for us. And so for us, it was like that concentrated effort, like, okay, this needs to be a priority in our lives after seeing that.
Yeah. And I think what it really comes down to at the end of the day is the power of entropy in everything we do. That if you don't inject energy into the system, it will all become room temperature, no matter what you're talking about. So yeah, that goes for running, that goes for relationships, like a ton. I mean, how many relationships, people have been together 15 years and then, the passion is like not there or whatever, which is normal to a certain extent. But the idea is that if instead you're able to re-inject energy over and over and over again, then maybe you can keep that going. Like that's what Addie showed us. And so with coaching, like, I mean, and not just that, we're probably like, in some circles we're probably made fun of for like exclamation points and telling people they're great and those sorts of things because maybe then we can help them just a little bit in whatever they're going through that day, like give them a little bit of that tailwind we were talking about, because we're never going to be able to push someone. Like, we say about with the athletes we coach, like coaches, I think get far too much credit for the success of athletes. It's like, no. Maybe like we just, gave them like a 0.25% little nudge in the direction they were always going to be able to go anyway. And so I think Addie showed us that. Through something as simple and cliche and maybe even like derided societally as an exclamation point, you can change everything for someone.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree. And especially at a time where we're so critical of ourselves, I often talk about the fact that, we would never talk to our loved ones, our friends, our family in the way that we like berate ourselves for things. And so the more support you can give people, the more you can make people feel better about themselves. I know we all agree on this is just the more, the better really. And I just wanted to kind of explain that because I think that is such an important point that Addie brought that into your life. And Bailey is very much doing the same thing for me right now. And so I'm seeing it as well. And, Megan, I wanted to switch gears in to talk about you. Another thing that I think a lot of people will be able to, resonate with you and learn from you is that I think a lot of people think that people at the top level, which you are, and we're at this point, are kind of able to live this life where they wake up and they, go for a run and when they want to, they take a nap, they wake up. And that is very much the life for a lot of people. But you were in medical school, still trying to train, getting up at 3 a.m. To get your training done, which is intense to say the least. But for those listening, was that worth it going through all that? And why was it worth it? I mean, I know the answer here from reading the book, but for someone listening who's thinking 3 a.m., like, how would that ever be worth it? Like, I'd just be too exhausted. What would you say?
Well, for me, running makes me a better person each day. I kind of need running to have that enthusiasm, that self-belief. And so I knew that going into med school. And it's funny, I actually had one morning I was on surgery rotation and I missed my 3 a.m. alarm to run. Mm-hmm. And I remember just being totally devastated. I mean, I woke up, I actually cried on my way to the hospital because I knew I was like, I'm not going to have the chance to get in this like powerful thing that makes me me. And I think having that understanding was helpful going into med school. And running, it's funny. It's like being a professional runner actually, for me, was way more challenging than being a med student. I think as a professional runner, there's so many unknowns. I mean, you could be injured, you could be totally great one day and injured the next. Whereas medical school is a very set path that you follow and is predictable. And so I tell people actually professional running is the hardest career that I've had.
That's interesting. And Dave, would you add anything?
I was hopping on a little story on that. So, while it makes her a better person and, like she really loves it and these sorts of things. I remember one day in particular, and there were a lot of days like this. So when she woke up at 3 a.m., it wasn't really safe where we were necessarily to run like normally. So we would go to this little middle school that had, I think, like a third of a mile little dirt thing around the outside.
So you would go with her at 3 a.m.?
Well, Addie and I would go.
Okay.
I wouldn't run. It's way too early for me to run.
David got brownie points for life for this.
Well, so I would just go to make sure, like for the first half hour, to make sure that, it was safe, no one was there, whatever. And so Addie and I would be fetching. But so Megan would pass us dozens of times in this period. She's just going in little loops. I remember one day in particular where every time she would pass, she'd just be like, I hate this. And she would like harmonize how much she hated it each time. But she was laughing like as she got farther and farther into the run every time she did it. So the idea being that like, even though it was this thing that meant a lot to her, it wasn't this thing that was like, perfect. It wasn't this thing that it wasn't like watching an instant gratification show on Netflix, like a comedy or something. It was that mixed sometimes, but it was also like a tragedy. It was also, all these other emotions wrapped up into it, which like integrated into it, made it this really big uplifting thing. But like, that wasn't all the time. That wasn't even most of the time. Well,
actually, I remember my first 3 a.m. run on the treadmill. I went and put my heart rate strap on, and my heart rate at easy effort was like 170. And that was a big eye opening for me. I was like, I'm going to have to modify my training for this. But there were certainly a lot of days that were not pretty in that process. But at the foundation, I loved it, and it allowed me to be me in the hospital, which was nice.
And, on that note, so you've mentioned that it wasn't necessarily enjoyable at the time, but you still like got it done. But how much of an exhaustion component came into this? Because again, I think people are probably imagining that, maybe it wasn't fun, but maybe you're some superhuman who can get away with 4 hours of sleep and, still feels great and is able to do this. Whereas other people might be thinking, I would just be so tired. Like, were you that tired? And how did you kind of, just kind of get yourself through it? Was it taking it a day at a time, or what did you do?
I was definitely pretty tired. And there were some ugly points in there. But I think as a med student, actually, you have the liberty of having these set blocks. And so there was I knew it was going to be 8 weeks on one hard rotation and then maybe 4 weeks on another easy rotation. And I think having those endpoints actually really helped. The other thing is that David was amazing during that time. So I literally actually didn't go to the grocery store I remember going I think it was like 8 months before I went to a grocery store. So, David was doing everything, and that was key. And then I would also I was a sleep camel. So, if I got home early from the hospital at like 6:30 at night, I would just go to bed. And so I actually wasn't averaging, I was probably averaging across the week 6 or 7 hours of sleep. So it wasn't that bad. It was just in kind of pretty funky chunks.
Yeah. Well, first I'd like to thank Chef Boyardee for the help with the cooking. But no, I told that story about her hating it, but I think most of the time she loved it because she understood that was part of it. So my favorite videos, they're still on their internet somewhere, is her at 2:30 or 3 a.m. Her warm up, I think it was a little bit of that fake it till you make it thing, but it would just be like putting on hip hop or whatever and just breaking down in the kitchen to warm up for the run, just doing dancing in the kitchen. And, so she was really good at that. Also, the sleep thing, I mean, I remember sometimes she would sleep like 12 or 13 hours when she could on like the one day she was off or whatever. So yeah, I mean, I think what you said about medical school being easier in some ways than running is something that a lot of athletes share.
Yeah.
When you actually see it behind the scenes because of running's uncertainty. Mm-hmm. You know, if you think you know where you're going with running, you're probably already wrong.
Yeah.
You know, whereas doctor, you know, there's like a path that is set, and it's really hard. It's so hard. It requires so much talent and skill and toughness, but you know, it's there for you. And so like what I admire a lot about Megan is like how she kind of stepped off that path too. And I imagine running kind of gave her some of the confidence to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Now, you mentioned there about Megan having a rough time. And I think one of the things I love about the articles that you do is just the honesty and the way that you're both able to kind of write to people in the way that they are thinking. One of your articles, David, I think this was yours, was running sucks sometimes and that's okay. And you mentioned that already once. So let's talk about that, because I often say that to people and they're always shocked to hear me say that. Like, wait, what? Like, why do you do it if it sucks? And B, aren't you supposed to be fast? So isn't it supposed to be comfortable for you? So let's talk about that, kind of both of your experiences with that and why you wrote that article and what that even means.
I think I wrote that article after one of those runs where like I had to go to the bathroom like 6 times during it, and it was just having a rough day. But I mean, I think more to the point is that running, just like anything else, sucks sometimes. Like anything that's good all the time, like the brain doesn't work like that. You know, maybe the closest thing you could get is drugs. And, you know, with that, like, you know, you're passed out behind an alley eventually. So the point being that like everyone goes through it. And I guess getting a window into so many pro athletes' lives and people that are just starting out with run walk at the same time, you see the same exact words used to describe the same feelings pretty much constantly. So maybe that pro athlete has a few more days. It's like more predictable. You know what I mean? Like they have a general feeling that on this day, it'll be one of those good days. And it's a little less predictable as someone starting out. But like everyone's saying the same stuff. Like sometimes it's like, oh, this was transcendent. It was effortless. I felt great. Other times it will be, I feel like I weigh 300 pounds at least. And, you know, I was miserable out there. I cut it short. You know what I mean? So like, that's part of it. And then why people do it in the face of that, I think people do it because of that. You know, I think that anyone that runs, the whole point is this, like the struggle essentially, because like if you didn't have this struggle, like there wouldn't be any feeling of accomplishment or these other positive things. So I like athletes to reframe it to, you know, when you have those bad days, like it's not because that gives the good days contest, is that, oh, those bad days are the point. Mm-hmm. Like those bad days are the thing that gives you this strength in life, but also gives you this understanding of like existence that non-runners don't have.
I think the thing I try to emphasize as a coach to my athletes as well is that each run and each race is not a test, and it's not a judgment of you as a person, and it's not a judgment of you as an athlete. So having a bad day does not mean your fitness is, you know, in the tanks. You know, having a string of bad days should make you consider, you know, kind of like, are there other things going on with your body? But just acknowledging that it's okay to have bad days, and it's okay to take a step back and say, hey, this isn't a judgment of myself. This isn't a judgment of my fitness. And sometimes they're just totally unpredictable for various reasons, and that's okay.
I love that. Thank you so much for explaining that. All right. And let's kind of talk a similar concept, but a different topic, being nutrition. You've both kind of spoken about this a lot, which I really love, that you both are very much like against the scale, very much against kind of counting things and overthinking it. And you even mentioned in the book about kind of how dangerous places like college teams can be when it comes to like eating disorders and kind of one person rubbing off onto the next. So tell us about your approach towards eating. You know, you've both been very successful within your running. You've also got successful athletes and everyday athletes who are, you know, just trying to look after their kids and have a full-time job and all this other stuff. So what is the approach to running, to nutrition that you both take, and why do you think, you know, it's been successful for you and others?
So with athletes, we always try to emphasize that all food is good food. That eating just a well-balanced diet having a good moderation. You can have sweets, you can do these things that, might be tasty or delicious to you, but just really getting back to the element of all food is good food is like kind of our key starting point. And then our second key point with athletes is that it's always important to err on the side of being a little heavier than a little lighter.
Yes.
We have seen, and actually, so I was a field hockey player in college and transitioned to the track team. And for me, it was quite a shocking transition because as field hockey, you're a strength player. And as a running athlete, you kind of think about these things a little bit more. And I saw firsthand for myself what happened when you kind of emphasize the nature of trying to be lighter. And I felt, it led to overtraining, it led to injuries. And it's funny, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a weight-based thing. It's like, if you are underfeeling unintentionally, that can do it as well. And so we always have athletes err on the side of caution and eat more whenever they think they should.
Yeah. The number of times we'll put in logs, like, make sure you're eating a ton, or like some specific, it's like pizza, burgers, or whatever, we'll actually put that in logs, like as what, not to say you should eat this particular thing, but like to give them a cue to like, oh, it's okay. We want you to do this always, but especially now. I think it gets back to two things. I'll start with like how maybe the like counterproductive ideas can start to churn in people's brains that I think will resonate with a lot of the listeners. It's like, okay, we're saying that, oh, you should be heavier for top performance. And that is definitely true. Like not heavier necessarily like, by weight, but more just like eating plenty. You should always have positive energy availability. But I think the problem becomes there will be people listening that are like, no, that's not true. Look at the people on the cover of the magazine. Look at all these other things. Or they'll look at their own experience and be like, well, I lost a little bit of weight and then my performance improved this one time. And what we saw as coaches, and like there's countless stories of, is it's like a delayed fuse. That as soon as that happens, you're lighting a bomb, and it's just a matter of time before that backfires. And because potential is always long distance, it's always on the horizon. By lighting that bomb, you're stopping what you're actually capable of, and that's why we see. That's my guess. One reason that with the track teams, especially D1 track teams, that a lot of the people do very well in college, but like from some of the team, not to name any specific teams, but I know there's teams that like one person might still be running.
Yes.
And, what could that team have done had they believed in themselves long-term and not gone down those paths, not lit that bomb? And that's the thing. It's like, maybe your performance for 1 month might not have been where it would if you took, a shortcut there, but like in 10 years, who knows where that could have led? Mm-hmm. And so, I think it's such a big issue. And I think most runners think about it sometimes. And basically what we just try to emphasize is that you want your strength. Running's a strength sport. It's essentially a bunch of little jumps forward. Like it is a plyometric sport. Mm-hmm. And I think when people start to reframe it like that, they can start to embrace it. And then the other thing is like, food is really freaking fun. Yeah. And like, if you view it as your friend and something that is like joyous to you, then, oh my gosh, life itself can be so much better. It's something that structures every day. So, because we care about happiness so much, it's like, we sometimes get so like, I'm like, tell me what you ate like after the race, just because it's like, we can celebrate that moment together, like that joy that's had.
I think one more important point on this topic is the role of genetics in this. And everyone has a different body type, and it's impossible to look on Instagram or to look at friends or to look at pictures and say this person is healthy or this person is not, because our genetics are all different. And so I think not playing that comparison game with yourself is important, and not comparing yourself to others. And we've seen that over and over again with athletes.
Yeah. Absolutely. And going back to square one and being like, getting back to that idea that we were talking about with running and performance, like you are perfect no matter what. Like we all want to change things about ourselves because that's how the human brain works. But, whatever you see in the mirror, whatever you see on the scale at the doctor's office that they make, whatever, it's like, it's perfect the way it is. And so, yeah, you can strive for self-improvement, but that self-improvement can only come from a place of self-love. Because if it comes from a place of not liking yourself, you're never going to find that self-acceptance, on a scale or in the mirror or on the track or anything.
So true. Oh, I love that. Thank you so much for explaining that. So many good points there, and just things that people need to hear. I would have needed to hear it a few years ago, although I probably wouldn't have listened, to be honest. I was so stuck in my ways of I'm doing the right thing. but hopefully it can bring people.
Tina, I think that's an amazing point. Like that usually when people need to hear this stuff, it's not necessarily something that you're going to be fully receptive to, even if it's short of disordered behavior, even if it's just natural, like, something that's more natural. And so, what I would say to athletes that are feeling that is that, like, cut yourself slack in whichever direction you're going. That, yeah, we're saying these things, but it's not easy for us all the time. Mm-hmm. And we see athletes going through it all the time, but you don't see it on their Instagram pages necessarily, And so basically the idea being like, no matter, like, even if you're not necessarily like agreeing with this, like, that's okay. Like, to give yourself patience and kindness with finding that answer for yourself, rather than thinking if you're not there now, then, you're deficient in some way, because this is a process too. Like, for us, we were fortunate that our process was accelerated through coaching, because you see so many stories and they're all similar. And it's just like, after a while, the pattern recognition thing in your brain goes off and it's like, okay, I can't, like, has to be something that we advocate for and talk about a lot. And, your experience was, so helpful to so many where, you started to do that. But like for a lot of people, they're just having their own experience. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, cut yourself slack, no matter what it is.
Well, one thing related to that, I just want to mention to wrap up with this. So thinking back, I would listen to what you were both saying and kind of say, well, that's great for them. They're obviously just really happy people that, like my husband, for example, he's always been very good at like food is fuel. I might spend like 3 hours making a dinner and I'll put it in front of him. And I'm like, well, what do you think? What do you think? And he's like, yeah, it's fine. And I'm like, like, I get really annoyed because I'm like, I put so much into this, but to him, that's just it. And so I would have put you two into that category, like, well, that's great. But I just want to say to anyone listening, like, I was at that point where I was thinking about food all the time. It was like, oh, for God's sake, how are you hungry again? Like, or, oh, well, I'll have that apple to tide me over till I'm going out because I need to save my calories for going out. When really, like, you can get to a place of where Megan and David are talking about, because I felt like they were just kind of exceptions, or would have been exceptions to the rules. But now I'm where you are and I can say that, yes, it is possible and it is so freeing. So if anyone is listening and you are kind of thinking, oh, you guys in your perfect life, it's not necessarily the case that they have a perfect life. And they've made that clear by talking about the struggles and the setbacks. But it is possible to reach a point where food can just be pure enjoyment. And it's going to take some work. It's going to take some fighting of thoughts, but it can be done. So I just wanted to finish off with that, as that was such a good point. And I know what I would have been thinking myself a few years ago. With that being said, we are just going to take a few moments to thank our sponsors, and then we will be back with the Running for Real 4. I was excited to introduce you to Aftershocks in that mind-blowing episode with Ray McClanahan a few weeks ago, and I'm really thankful to Aftershocks for sponsoring this episode. I've heard from many of you just how much you loved your Aftershocks, and now I can definitely see what all the fuss is about. In fact, I've been wearing them for all my long runs in training for the Boston Marathon. They're so comfortable that I don't feel the need to rip them off and rub my ears as they hurt as soon as I click stop on my watch. You barely notice they're there, really. I also love that you hear your music or you're running for a podcast, or I suppose any other podcast you listen to, through the bone conduction technology. I wasn't sure I'd be a fan of that, to be honest. Vibrating through my cheekbones, that sounded like a recipe for me feeling dizzy, but I was wrong. Not only did I feel no dizziness whatsoever, but I absolutely love the fact that I can hear my music or podcast while also hearing sounds of the environment around me. I feel safer and feel like crossing the road isn't risking my life every time. And I can hear the sounds of nature. The good parts of actually being out on a run that we can easily miss when we have in-ear headphones. As a Running for Real listener, you can get $50 off a Trex Titanium Endurance Bundle at tina.aftershocks.com. That's TINA.AFTERSHOKZ or Z, whichever you prefer, .com, and go see what all the buzz is about. Get yourself a pair. Friends, when you are in the middle of a marathon training slog, or any other training slog for that matter, you know when you feel just so damn exhausted, you don't know if you're going to make it to race day, let alone through the race, and you might just go curl up on the side of a road to take a nap. Yeah, I don't just remember those days. I feel them too, especially on the long runs. They are kicking my butt, but I don't know how I even used to make it through 24-mile long runs. One year, I even did a 17-minute 5K in the middle. Makes me exhausted even thinking about it. You know what helps though? A good recovery routine. Now, you heard Christy Ashwandan on here recently talking about how important it is for us to get more sleep. And like you, I hear her. Sleep is important. We know that. And we're trying so hard to get there, especially with those tips we learned from Amy this month. But it's not always as easy as it sounds, is it? How else can you help yourself recover then? Well, for me, taking Body Health Perfect Aminos every day helps a lot. It contains all the essential amino acids the body needs to support and maintain the muscular, skeletal, and hormonal system. Many people know that protein is essential for optimum health, but most assume that they're consuming enough through food. So why is there a need for an amino acid supplement? Well, the simple answer is, yeah, you do get quality aminos from your foods, such as eggs, meat, fish, nuts. But most of that protein in food is not converted into body protein, and it just kind of makes waste that the body has to get rid of. Perfect Amino is an amino acid supplement that is 99% utilized by the body to make protein. No other form of protein comes close. So hop on over to tinamuir.com/aminos. That's AMINOS to get yourself 10% off. They have a 100% money back guarantee. So what do you have to lose? All right, just 4 more questions for you. I'm not sure if we're going to have, I think we can do one of each for each of you. So starting with Megan, maybe you can start one piece of advice you'd like to give the listeners for life.
Yes, this actually comes from Siri Lindley, who I know is who was a guest on your podcast. We're actually sitting in her house right now. We were so fortunate.
You're in Siri Lindley's house?
Well, we actually bought her house.
Yeah,
so she sold her house. We got into
total coincidence.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. So we're sitting in her old office, but when we were meeting her through the house buying process, she told us the power of being fearlessly authentic to who you are. And to me, that is so important. And really harnessing the stories that make you who you are, finding the joy in who you are, and just letting yourself have opportunities to fail through that mindset as well.
I love that. Yeah, I would just say that the world between our two ears can be dark and full of terrors, to borrow from Game of Thrones, like for everyone. And even if people aren't suffering from anxiety or depression, so try as much as you can to get out of that world, and I think that can be a coach, that can be a therapist, that can be a teacher or whatever. But most importantly, just talk to people about how you feel, because your story, no matter what it is shared.
Yes.
Maybe not in the same way, but everyone has analogies to it. And I think it would help. I wish for just one day, we could make everything anonymous and share the training logs, and people could just understand that, we're all in this together. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Wasn't there a website? I swear I learned about this in my English class once. Oh, this has just popped into my mind. Wasn't there a website 10, 15 years ago? And it was something about secrets where you could anonymously post your deepest, darkest secret to get it off your chest. But it was completely anonymous, so no one could know it was yours. So
I feel like you might be describing Twitter.
Maybe. No, I'm going to look that up, because that's just popped into my mind, and I haven't thought about it since I was a freshman in college. But I'm going to look that, because it's kind of essentially what you're saying. But I love that idea. But sorry, that really went off topic.
I love it.
It just popped into my mind. All right, one person to follow on social media and why for each of you. And you're not allowed to pick Siri Lindley if that's what you were going to say.
Well, she is awesome to follow on social media. She's an amazing source of positivity.
She's given.
She's just amazing. So I would go with Michelle Obama. I actually just finished her book, Becoming, and she is fearlessly authentic to who she is on social media.
Love that. Yep.
And I honestly, she's hilarious too. I really enjoy following all the family pictures and everything. So she's definitely one person I would follow.
I'm going to go with Pete Holmes, who's a comedian with a great podcast called You Made It Weird. Not because he's a comedian, but because I think he preaches this gospel of self-acceptance better and more in a more entertaining way than we ever could, or at least I ever could, Megan. And yeah, I think it's just the number of times I've listened to him and then been like, that's what it's about. It's just been through the roof. So.
Okay, cool. And what's the name of his podcast again?
You Made It Weird.
You Made It Weird. Okay. I'll put links to that and both of the social media accounts in the show notes. All right. How do you both want to be remembered on this podcast?
Ooh. So I think enthusiastic and authentic. Bringing those exclamation points, a little bit of Addie Dog smile, and some of Cyrilinely as well.
Love that.
Yeah, I would say like an exclamation point. I was thinking about like our epitaph would just say "dead!" exclamation point. Yeah, not because and I think like it's important for the listeners to know that's not our natural state. Like, especially if you've never read the book, like this is something that, we try to cultivate over time, but like we're naturally quiet, introverted people. Mm-hmm. But like, yeah, if people could think of us as that, then that would be awesome.
I think that comes across. So well done there. And finally, what is a running for real moment? Something that only runners will understand that you would like to share each?
Ooh. So for me right now, I'm coming back from a hamstring injury. I've actually been out. I was out for like 15 weeks, which is the longest I've ever been out for anything. And so I'm sure a lot of runners can identify with this, the feeling that you have when you come back for your first run and you feel like your legs are like elephant legs. Like it just, everything feels so slow. And you kind of have that question in your mind, like, am I ever going to be a runner again? And that's something that I've been struggling with recently. And also kind of just finding the small joys and the daily wins and the daily progress.
She's still dancing to hip hop before run.
Yeah.
And when she couldn't run, she was dancing to hip hop before bikes. I would say like maybe to end it, since we were on the podcast together, is something a little maybe not connected to running so much. Is a couple of weeks ago, we had a pretty, for us, like memorable disagreement. And this was about kind of big life things of like, we love what we're doing. We know what we're going to do, but Megan has a lot of opportunities and like deciding where we're going to be, basically all this complicated stuff. And, I think a lot of people will say, oh, well, their relationship seems really like perfect and all this stuff. But yeah, we had a big disagreement. And I mean, we went to sleep and it was mostly resolved, but not really. Like, and so, yeah, like, and I mean, we like through it all though, like we knew we loved each other and all that stuff. And knowing that like, if your relationship has rocky parts, if your running has rocky parts, if your job has rocky parts, whatever, like that is still part of the process. And like, I mean, for us, I feel like our love's been stronger than ever recently. And it's because that, the conclusions we had to reach through that, but that's the way running works too. So
true. Oh, thank you for sharing that. That's a really good example and something I think that is good for people to hear as well. All right. So they can purchase your book, The Happy Runner. There will be links in the show notes for people to go get. But where else can people find you /Addie on social media?
I think Addie is probably the most important and also the embodiment of us. She is Addie Does Stuff on Instagram. I am Meg Roche 33, I think, on Instagram. I should really know that better.
Yeah.
And our website is swaprunning.com. Even if we can't coach you or you don't want to coach, you can always, our email's on there. Always send us an email, even with like convoluted, detailed training questions. And we'll get back to you pretty quickly with like our input on it. Our goal is to try to help when we can.
I don't know if you want to do that. Knowing this audience, you are going to get bombarded with massive long questions. So you might have be careful what you wish for there, because I know the people listening and love you guys. You are going to definitely keep them busy. So I look forward to hearing about that.
It's a good stress test on how much you know about coaching.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like
true.
I love those questions because it's always like, it pushes us.
Sometimes we got to research. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. Well, then you've heard the challenge, guys, so you can go ask them some questions. Well, thank you both so much for sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, and just being who you are, relentlessly authentic. I just appreciate you both so much, all that you have done. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for being you. And thanks to all the listeners too. Like we love this community.
This was so much fun.
My friends, if you have a minute and you could leave a review on your favorite podcast player, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Spotify, or whatever else podcast player you use to listen to this podcast, or if you would subscribe to this podcast, you will help me get out in front of new runners to make our tribe even bigger and even better. It might not seem like you as one person can make a difference, but really, It helps a lot. And it shows me you appreciate the hard work I put in for those. Thank you so much. Aren't they just wonderful? I strongly recommend the Happy Runner book if you love their attitude to life, or maybe you just want to go follow Addie, as she definitely is a great dog to follow and reminds us to stay in the present, which is something we can all do a bit better at, right? Hopefully you enjoyed this episode with Megan and David, and there's links to everything we talked about today in the show notes at tinamuir.com/episode 109. And remember to go leave a review on iTunes or your favorite podcast player if you want a shout out on the podcast. So until next week, have a great week.
Thanks for listening to the Running for Real podcast. Be sure to check out tinamuir.com for show notes and even more helpful running information.